Lam Giang, a quiet mountain village in northern Vietnam, was a place bound by deep tradition and interwoven lives. Here, every villager knew one another, and life depended on the steady flow of the mountain stream that sustained the rice fields, vegetable patches, and fruit orchards dotting the hillside. The farmers relied on the stream's waters as much as they relied on each other, bound by a shared struggle against the forces of nature and circumstance. They lived in close quarters, helped each other through droughts and seasons of heavy rain, and lent a hand during the difficult harvests. Among these villagers was Tran Van Long, a respected farmer in his early 30s. He had inherited his small plot of land and, with years of hard work, had transformed it into a steady source of livelihood. Long was a man of simple values and dedication. His wife, Pham Thi Hoa, was beloved for her kindness and willingness to help her neighbors. They had a small child and had recently taken in Hoa's teenage sister, Pham Thi Ha, to help with family chores and to give her a stable home near the village school. The family lived in a modest wooden house at the edge of the Hamlet, where mist rolled over the hills each morning, settling around their home before lifting with the sun. Long's days were spent cultivating the fields, his calloused hands a testament to years of labor. In the evenings, the family's laughter could be heard drifting through the village, a reminder to others of the warmth and unity that bound them together. But this harmony was not shared by all. On the far side of Lam Giang, in a small isolated dwelling, lived Tran Van Long. Though younger than Long by a few years, Hung was known for his reclusive nature. He too farmed a small plot of land. But unlike Long's well-tended fields, Hung's crops struggled, thin and uneven in the dry season's heat. Hung had been quick to blame this misfortune on Long, accusing him of diverting water from the shared stream to irrigate his own crops. Hung's grievances began as whispered complaints but soon escalated into bitter accusations, muttered to anyone who would listen. For Hung, the water issue was not just an inconvenience, it was an affront. His frustration grew into resentment, a gnawing feeling that Long was actively trying to sabotage him. Though villagers dismissed the dispute as minor, just another farm grievance, Hung's simmering anger was something different. Unaddressed and unchecked, his bitterness festered in isolation, growing darker with each passing day. What others saw as a minor dispute over water rights, Hung saw as a personal attack. And then, one morning, the village awoke to an ominous silence. August 12, 2015, began as an ordinary day. The mist hung low over Lam Giang, curling around the hills and casting the village in a soft gray light. But as the morning stretched on, villagers began to notice the silence from Long's home. There were no sounds of footsteps on the wooden porch, no voices carrying on the morning air. By afternoon, several villagers, uneasy with the silence, decided to check on the family. The neighbors gathered outside Long's house, a wooden structure nestled at the base of a hill. The front door stood slightly open, swaying with the breeze, an unusual sight in the tightly knit village where privacy was highly regarded. One of the neighbors, an older man named Hyo, stepped forward and called out for Long. There was no answer. With each passing second, a sense of dread grew. Finally, Hyo stepped inside, squinting in the dim light filtering through the windows. The air inside was heavy, metallic, a smell that hit him with a sickening realization. He stopped, frozen, as his eyes adjusted to the sight before him. Blood soaked the wooden floor, smeared in dark, thick pools leading from the kitchen to the front room. And there, lying amidst overturned furniture and broken dishes, were the bodies of Long, Hoa, their young son, and Ha. It was a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood spattered the walls, and the positions of the bodies spoke of a desperate struggle, a fight for survival that had ended in tragedy. The others stepped back, faces pale, hands covering their mouths as the full weight of the scene sank in. Within minutes, the village was alive with cries of fear and disbelief. Someone ran to the police post at the edge of the village, raising the alarm. Local officers arrived quickly, their expressions grim as they took in the horror of the scene. But the scale and brutality of the massacre were overwhelming, and they knew they would need reinforcement from the provincial capital, Yen Bai. Within hours, a team of experienced investigators and forensic specialists arrived, led by Captain Lam Giang, a seasoned investigator known for his dedication and sharp mind. Captain Phuc entered the house with a deep sense of foreboding. He had seen many crime scenes over the years, but something about the brutality here was different. The attack had been savage, almost primal, as if fueled by more than just anger. Phuc surveyed the room, noting the chaos. The blood-stained walls, the overturned chairs, the broken fragments of dishes scattered across the floor. Every detail told a story, one of terror and unrestrained violence. As the forensic team set to work, carefully photographing the scene and marking evidence, Phuc focused on the items left behind. Near the back door, they found a machete, its blade smeared with blood, discarded as if abandoned in a hurry. Outside, a pair of sandals lay in the grass, partially hidden by the undergrowth. Muddy footprints, smeared but still distinct, led away from the house, disappearing into the dense forest beyond. Phuc's mind raced as he examined the clues. Whoever had committed this atrocity had left in haste, but not before leaving behind a trail of evidence. The violence was intense, personal. It bore the mark of someone who knew the family, someone with a deep, burning grudge. Outside, a crowd had gathered, villagers huddled together, faces pale and stricken. Some clutched each other, murmuring prayers, while others stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. The news of the massacre spread quickly, a dark ripple of fear that coursed through the village. It was then that the name surfaced: Dang Van Hung. As investigators began their work, interviewing villagers and gathering accounts, one name came up over and over again: Dang Van Hung. The villagers spoke in hushed voices, piecing together memories of recent conversations, bitter remarks, angry mutterings. Hung had long accused Long of stealing water, claiming that his own crops were drying up because of Long's selfishness. To most villagers, it was just another grievance, the kind that came and went. But as they spoke, a clearer picture of Hung's resentment emerged, a resentment that seemed to have grown into something toxic, something dangerous. Captain Phuc listened to the testimonies carefully, piecing together the story of the feud. The more he heard, the clearer it became that Hung harbored a deep-seated grudge against Long's family. Hung had been heard cursing Long's name, muttering accusations that went beyond water rights. He spoke as if Long had intentionally ruined him, sabotaging his life and his livelihood. Hung's bitterness was not just frustration. It was the kind of hatred that festered in silence, growing darker with each passing day. But as the investigation intensified, it became clear that Hung was nowhere to be found. His small house, a rundown structure on the outskirts of the village, was deserted. The door hung open, the rooms empty, as if he had left in a hurry. Captain Phuc and his team searched the premises, but aside from a few personal items left behind, there was no sign of where he might have gone. The team quickly mobilized a manhunt, enlisting local authorities and provincial officers to cover as much ground as possible. Phuc knew the landscape well. The hills and forests surrounding Lam Giang were vast and treacherous, filled with dense vegetation and hidden paths that only a local would know. He instructed his team to set up roadblocks along the main trails and enlisted villagers to assist in scouring the surrounding areas. As days passed, officers discovered traces of Hung's presence in the forest, a makeshift campfire, remnants of food, and faint footprints leading deeper into the wilderness. The evidence was clear. Hung was on the run, using his knowledge of the terrain to evade capture. The forest became a labyrinthine refuge, its shadows and silence concealing him as he moved through the trees. But for Captain Phuc, each clue only heightened the urgency. He knew that a man capable of such violence was unlikely to stop at one act. Hung was desperate, cornered, and dangerous. And as the days stretched into nights, the pursuit intensified, a relentless chase that would either end in capture or more bloodshed. The forest around Lam Giang was a dense, shadowed maze, stretching endlessly into the mountains and shrouding the paths in a heavy mist that seemed to cling to every tree and rock. The forest was both Hung's greatest ally and his curse, a sanctuary he knew well, where he could hide, but also a prison that grew smaller with each step of the police patrols closing in. For Captain Lam Phuc, the unfolding manhunt was a high-stakes chase. Every delay risked Hung slipping further into the wilderness or worse, finding another victim. Officers scoured the hillside with dogs trained to follow even the faintest scent, pressing through brambles and thorned vines, searching for any trace of the fugitive. Each branch snapped underfoot, each leaf rustled in the breeze, yet the forest seemed to reveal nothing. Late on the third night, an officer radioed in a report. At the edge of a clearing, they had found remnants of a campsite. The ashes were cold but recent enough to suggest Hung had rested there within the last day. Nearby, they found food wrappers, torn and discarded, along with a partially burned piece of cloth. The evidence hinted at a man who had been living rough, moving in the shadows, always a step ahead. He's running, but he's not gone far, Captain Phuc told his team. He knows these hills well, but he's leaving signs. He's getting tired. The air in the camp was thick with tension. Officers traded anxious glances, some rubbing their necks and shoulders from the physical strain of the search. Each passing day intensified the pressure on them. Each step that seemed to lead nowhere weighed on their spirits. Captain Phuc, however, remained unwavering, his gaze sharp and calculating. He knew this terrain just as well as Hung did. He had spent years investigating cases across similar mountainous regions, and he had learned that every fugitive, no matter how well they knew the land, would eventually make a mistake. Early on the morning of August 15th, the team received another break. A villager, while gathering firewood near a stream, reported hearing footsteps and seeing a shadow move swiftly through the underbrush. He had thought it was a deer at first, but the shadow was upright, distinctly human. The villager pointed officers in the direction he had seen the figure move, describing it with such urgency that Captain Phuc was convinced they were close. "We're tightening the noose," he told his team, gathering the officers and giving instructions to split into two groups to flank the area. "We go in quietly. No lights, no radios. Move with the shadows." The officers fanned out, moving in tense silence as they made their way through the dense brush. With each step, they scanned the forest floor for any signs of a trail. The air was damp and still, and the only sounds were the muffled rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Then at the edge of a narrow stream, they saw him. Hung was crouched by the water's edge, his face haggard and drawn, eyes darting as he filled an old plastic bottle from the stream. He looked exhausted, his clothes torn and dirty. His body hunched as though he were carrying an invisible weight. For a split second, he seemed oblivious to his surroundings, his focus solely on quenching his thirst. But then, he looked up. His eyes met those of the nearest officer, and in an instant, he sprang to his feet, splashing through the water as he tried to flee. The officers surged forward, cutting off his escape. Hung stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him, and he fell to his knees, hands raised in surrender. The chase had ended. As they handcuffed him and led him away, Captain Phuc watched him closely, noting the way Hung's shoulders slumped, his face devoid of expression. There was no remorse, no sign of regret, only a cold, empty acceptance of his fate. At the Yen Bai provincial headquarters, Hung sat alone in the interrogation room, his wrists cuffed, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond the gray walls that surrounded him. Captain Phuc watched from behind the one-way mirror, studying the man who had evaded them for days, the man who had left a trail of death and horror in his wake. When Phuc entered the room, he moved with calm authority, taking a seat across from Hung, his face unreadable. They sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with the unspoken gravity of what had transpired. "Tell me why," Phuc began, his voice steady. "Why did you kill them?" Hung's gaze remained distant, but he began to speak, his voice a hollow whisper. He spoke of the stream, of the water that had once flowed freely to his crops, but had, in his mind, been taken by Long. He spoke of how his own plants withered as Long's thrived, how he watched as Long's family lived in ease while he struggled, barely scraping by. "It wasn't right," Hung muttered, almost to himself. "He took everything from me. My crops, my water, my life." Captain Phuc listened, his face impassive, as Hung's words twisted from self-pity to resentment, each sentence laced with the bitterness that had driven him to the unthinkable. And then, with an unsettling calmness, Hung described the night he had gone to Long's house, machete in hand. He spoke of the anger that had fueled him, a rage so powerful it had drowned out reason. In his mind, he wasn't simply taking revenge. He was reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. As he confessed, detailing the events in chilling clarity, Captain Phuc noted the absence of remorse in his tone. Hung did not see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as a victim who had been wronged, a man who had been pushed to violence by the circumstances around him. When he finished, the room fell silent once more. Captain Phuc studied him, searching for a hint of humanity, some trace of empathy, but found only an abyss of cold indifference. With Hung's confession in hand, Captain Phuc and his team turned their attention to solidifying the case against him. Forensic analysis of the crime scene had already provided crucial evidence, and now, with Hung's own words confirming his guilt, they pieced together the details to form a coherent narrative of the events leading up to the massacre. The blood-stained machete recovered from Long's home was examined in greater detail, its blade tested to confirm it bore the DNA of all 4 victims. The sandals found outside the house were confirmed to be Hung's, their tread matching footprints leading away from the scene. And in the corner of the room, forensic experts had discovered something even more incriminating: a fragment of cloth torn from a shirt, matching the one Hung was wearing at the time of his arrest. The psychological profile completed by specialists added another layer to the case. Hung's anger had been simmering for months, festering into a dangerous obsession that ultimately led him to see Long as the embodiment of everything he had lost. In his mind, Long had taken the very lifeblood of his crops, and by extension, his future. His resentment had reached a point of no return, distorting reality and fueling his belief that violence was the only way to resolve the perceived injustice. For Captain Phuc, the case was airtight, each piece of evidence locking into place like a grim puzzle. The physical evidence, Hung's confession, the psychological analysis, all pointed to a man who had chosen to destroy an entire family over a feud that, in the eyes of the world, seemed insignificant. The trial began on a somber morning in Yen Bai, drawing the attention of the entire province. Villagers from Lam Giang filled the courtroom, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief. The atmosphere was heavy, each person grappling with the realization that one of their own had committed an atrocity that would haunt them for years to come. The prosecution presented the evidence meticulously, laying out the events in stark detail: photographs of the crime scene, the forensic reports, and Hung's confession were all shown to the court. The prosecutor spoke with unwavering conviction, describing Hung as a man driven by a twisted sense of entitlement, a man who had allowed his resentment to consume him entirely. When Hung took the stand, he showed no remorse, speaking of Long as if he were an adversary rather than a fellow villager. His words shocked those in attendance, his detachment a chilling reminder of the depths his anger had reached. For the jury, the decision was clear. In the end, the court found Dang Van Hung guilty on all counts, sentencing him to life imprisonment. The judge's words were firm as he delivered the sentence, condemning Hung's actions as a betrayal of the very fabric of community and compassion that held Lam Giang together. When the trial concluded, the villagers returned to Lam Giang with heavy hearts. The house where Long's family had lived now stood empty, a silent testament to the horrors that had unfolded. Many villagers gathered at the site, laying flowers and holding a quiet vigil in memory of the family they had lost. In the weeks that followed, a profound change swept through the village. The elders held community meetings, urging open dialogue, encouraging neighbors to voice their grievances rather than letting them fester in silence. They spoke of the importance of unity and understanding, of the dangers that lay in resentment and isolation. Lam Giang's residents took the lessons of Long's family to heart, striving to ensure that their shared resources remained a symbol of life, not a source of division. For them, the memory of Long, Hoa, their child, and Ha was a somber reminder of how quickly harmony could be shattered. As time passed, the village returned to its quiet rhythm, yet the shadows of that dark August day remained, a reminder woven into the hills themselves.